In this video, I'm going to show you how to bind off stitches. So once you're done with your knitting pattern or your work and you have your stitches, you're going to bind off your stitches. And again, different patterns will call for different things. But if your pattern just calls for a simple bind off, then this is one way how you could do it. What I have here is just a little rectangular swatch that I've knit. It's a very simple one, stockinette stitch, which is one side knit, one side purl. And as you can see, these are the nice little purl bumps and the knit stitch. So to bind off, and what I'm going to do here is the next row on this pattern would have just been a knit row. So I'm going to bind off on this knit row, and to do that I'm going to start by knitting the first stitch just regularly like you would knit the first stitch. Then I'll go ahead and knit the second stitch as well. And now with binding off, you're essentially decreasing the stitches. You're eventually decreasing the stitches so that you have a nice little edge and you don't have any stitches on the needles. So to decrease the stitch, what I'm going to do now, after I've knit these first two stitches, I'm going to take this left hand needle, insert it through this front loop of the right hand needle, of the right hand needle stitch, the first stitch, and I'm going to pull it over the second stitch, okay, and drop it. So now I started out with 2 stitches, now I'm down to 1 stitch. We'll do the same thing for the next stitch. So go ahead and insert your needle, knit the next stitch. So you have 2 stitches on this needle. You're going to insert your needle through the first stitch, and what I like to do is I like to hold on to this working yarn and just kind of tug on it a little bit, so it kind of holds that stitch in place, the stitch that you're going to be bringing this stitch kind of over it. So you're going to try and hold that stitch in place while you bring this first stitch over and above it, and then drop. Okay, so again, insert, knit. Once you've knit the 2 stitches, now again you're going to take this first stitch, pull it over this stitch, and that's how you'll keep going down the line, stitch after stitch, to cast them off. So each time you're knitting another stitch, bringing that previous stitch off. You could do the same thing with purl. So on these last couple stitches, I'll show you how to do purl, and you'll notice you get a nice little edge, and similar to your cast on edge. Okay, so there's your cast on. Oh, let me turn it this way. There's your cast on edge, and there's your cast off edge. Okay, the cast off edge tends to be a little bit tighter than the cast on edge. All right, now if you wanted to bind these off in purl wise rather than knit wise, like we've been binding these ones off, then you do the same thing, except you'd be purling the stitches. So let's assume I've purled this first stitch. I'm going to purl the next stitch. Remember, for purl, the yarn needs to be forward. So I'm going to purl this next stitch, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I need to take this stitch, bring it over and above the second stitch, and drop it off. So I'm going to insert the needle this way, bring it over and beyond, and drop it off. So the inserting and dropping off is identical whether you do it knitwise or purlwise. It's just that the stitch, the next stitch that you bring over to this needle, you have to decide whether it's the knit stitch or purl stitch. And sometimes you'll bind in pattern. You might bind a few stitches knitwise, and you might bind a few stitches purlwise, depending on the pattern, and that's fine too. Different types of bind offs will give you different edges. They'll also either give you a loose edge or a tight edge. So depending on that, you can decide depending on what your pattern calls for. Now when you're at the last stitch here, what you're going to do is just kind of widen it out a little bit, take your needle out, and leave about 3 to 4 inch tail or so. Snip off the yarn and put this yarn through this loop and then pull. You can tighten it up a little bit, and there you have it. Now you'll notice I have a little kink here because I did these stitches knitwise and I did these stitches purlwise. So you'll notice the difference in the edging just a little bit. So whichever way you pick, you might want to follow the same way if you're going to do it all knitwise, if you want to avoid this kind of a kink. Or if your pattern is where 2 of your stitches are knit and 2 of your stitches are purl, and you bind them off alongside the pattern or like the pattern, then yeah, it's going to look different. But this is your basic cast off. In the next video, I'll show you how to weave in these ends so your work looks nice and pretty.